reconciliation. We acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So welcome, I'm Catriona Le May Doan, President and CEO of Sport Calgary, and we hosted a grant writing workshop, I think it was last year. These years are blending together. Sarah's nodding yes, so it must be last year. For those who didn't join us, it's going to be pretty relaxed. We have an opportunity to ask questions. We have two guests with us. I'll say grant writing experts. I'm going to call you guys that. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. And again, this is the first step. And then on June 8th, we're going to actually have an in-person workshop as well with Sara. So let me introduce our two guests. The first, Sara Stepa from Step Up Consulting. She's been raising funds for private and community causes for over a decade and has managed numerous granting programs throughout her career. As an active participant on both sides of the grant pipeline, she's a strong understanding of what grantors are looking for and what it takes to put together a robust application. She's assisted in raising millions of dollars for community-driven projects. She has a passion for helping organizations demonstrate the impacts of their projects and share their unique stories. Sara, thank you for joining us once again. Brad Ellard has been the regional manager for Alberta Northwest Territories for Canadian Tire Jumpstart charity since 2018. Prior to joining Jumpstart, he spent 7 years with the Oilers Entertainment Group in event presentation and community engagement roles. Brad is a graduate of Mount Royal University's Bachelor of Health and Physical Education, Sport and Recreation Management program, and has a BA in Economics from the University of Calgary. Through his work with Jumpstart, Brad builds relationships with organizations to help kids overcome financial and accessibility barriers to sport and recreation in an effort to provide inclusive play for kids of all abilities. He is committed to giving kids from families in financial need the same chance to participate as their neighbors, their classmates, and their friends. So Brad, thanks again for joining us. So we have online people from various organizations, and we know that pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID, financial barrier, that's one of the biggest barriers still. We know it. Sport, you know, we went through a exciting day yesterday, but I don't think once throughout the whole day, I'm just going to say it, I don't think sport was even mentioned. So sport is not at the top of anybody's priority list, and it should be. So we need to get some money in the hands of organizations. So I'm going to start with probably the most basic question. You know, what do you need to have in place? And just to let everybody know, we have a page and we've updated it on our website, grants that we monitor. But if you also find a grant that's not on there, we have a form to fill out so that you can let us know and we can let organizations know. But there are a ton of grants. It's overwhelming. It's confusing. To both of you, what do you need to have in place? Oh, thank you, Sandra, for putting up. This is the new page of our website. So these are the ones that we monitor. You can click on the link and then it's going to show you, see all the grants. There you go. And again, like there are lots, lots and lots and lots, different timelines, etc. Brad and Sara, what do you need to have in place before you begin writing? Because it is overwhelming. And I'm going to throw that first question out there to whoever. We're just going with the flow here. Sara, why don't you, okay, Brad, you unmuted first. You're up.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as you noted, there's so many different types of grants, and first and foremost, I think you need to identify the schedule of when the intakes are relative to when you're expecting to execute whatever you're applying for. I can speak specifically to Jumpstart side of things. We have 3 different intakes throughout the year, and it spreads out based on a program start date of what people are trying to achieve with their activity or initiative. But the lead up to that is about a 2-month process, right? So you kind of, if you miss the ball from the get-go, it puts you behind on the 8 ball. So that's where I would start for sure. And I think having a clear understanding of what you're going to ask for is very important from the get-go. I think if you spend too much time in the grant providing almost additional information that's not necessary to what you're being asked about for, can cloud the true intention of what you're asking for. So having that knowledge and understanding before you even enter into the process is probably the first step I would take.
So I'm going to let you touch on that, and then I'm going to ask Brad a follow-up question to that. But I'm going to let you touch on that first question first.
Thanks, Catriona. I definitely would agree on your second point there, Brad, is really knowing what you're applying for. Time and time again, I work with groups that they're trying to mold their needs or their project to a grantor rather than being specific about what they're trying to do and what they're trying to achieve. And then you lose the nuance, you lose the connection to your community or the sector or the sport that you're actually trying to serve through your programs or through your events. And so having a really strong understanding before you apply to a grant or before you're even looking for a grant will really position you in a much stronger space to be applying for things. So you're not kind of making it up as you go, but having a clear distinction of what you want to do, why, and how you're going to do it.
So it's funny you went on that second question, because this was what I was actually going to ask you guys. What about though, like if an organization knows that it needs some funding and has ideas, but not a very specific, so starts looking through grants and they start to actually do what you just said not to do, is to kind of see that there's an opportunity and go, okay, well, I can actually create a project on that. Is that a don't do that?
I wouldn't say it's a don't, but for groups that are not seasoned grant writers, you get distracted, or there's sort of the idea of scope creep in a sense that you're trying to fit into, or you're moving away from what you're actually trying to achieve. When you really have a strong understanding of your goals and your mission, your programs, then you can start to sort of mold or respond to grants that pop up. But I think in the beginning, it's really important to start with a really strong understanding of your programs, what you need money for, and what you're trying to achieve. Then later on, when you have a better idea, you have some experience under your belt, you can start responding to grantors or their calls for funding and create some stuff. But you want to be really careful that you're not creating more work for the organization, especially sport. They're under-resourced. They don't have a lot of staff, a lot of volunteer-run organizations, programs, and you don't want to be creating a program just to create a program because there's a fund for it. When you have a specific level or a minimal amount of resources, don't create work that you don't need just because there's a grant. So that's where I think it's you have to be a little bit cautious.
Yeah, and I would build on that if there's an opportunity to reach out to the grantor, reach out to them, spend time chatting. And that's part of what my role is the regional manager for Jumpstart, covering this area, this province. If I have the ability, I will 100% chat through the grant and try to explain, or even hear out an idea, hear out a brainstorming session. I've done it with some organizations in the past. I've been the fly on the wall and in the Zoom context of things, just sitting there listening to a group of people chat through an idea. And then I go, oh, yeah, actually, let's go down this path, or that might not work. So I know not all grantors are able to do that, but whether it's directly from the organization or another, if you look on their website and you see an organization that received funding, talk to that organization and find out how they got the approval and what the process was like.
I'm glad you brought that up, Brad, because I mean, the fact that you do that with some organizations, I don't know if people know that you can do that, because it almost feels like you're reporting to a principal. When you see this form, like it feels very intimidating. And when you say you've met with some, what would be the percentage, like, of those that apply? How many actually reach out to you to ask questions, would you say? Do you have a percentage even?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm putting just top of my head, I would say it's less than 20%. Like, it's a small amount. And on the other end as well, like, asking for feedback as to why you got declined or didn't get the full funding, that's even less, I would say. So our system is set up to be a bit, not direct, I guess, right? It has to service the whole country for our granting processes. But I always try to include a message in any of the declines to say, contact your regional manager. Here's my email address. And just the same as a job interview or, a relationship with someone, to follow up and say, why didn't this work? Let's figure this out. It's usually you could turn a no into a yes if you do that in most cases.
Well, I guess it's a learning process too, but I love the fact that, if groups have an opportunity to reach out beforehand and afterwards as well. Sara, have you seen that from a lot of grantors, that they do give that opportunity, that communication on both ends to, because one of the things is people understanding, does this grant actually fit within our organization? So do you find that most grantors are there to answer questions?
I'd say more and more are moving in that direction, and definitely foundations, corporate groups, they're definitely creating more of that. Government, they're trying to, I'd say, but sometimes they don't have the capacity to have these meetings, but they are trying to shift. I know the government of Alberta, they've started to implement a couple of mechanisms that I've tried to exercise with some of the people I've been working with, and it hasn't been very smooth, but I know a lot of grantors, they're trying to shift away from that transactional funding, which is just here's money, report back, to more transformational, which is having that conversation, aligning the programs, aligning your impact, and really coaching groups on how to develop a project that aligns with the funder, but also aligns with their mission. So it's definitely a shift that's happening. I think COVID really shifted that as well, where there was a lot of response funding coming out. And so there couldn't be the same level of structure. So there was a little bit more trust-based funding going out. There was more, I guess, trust in the organizations as well to deliver on what they said they could deliver on versus having to have all of the details all at once. So there's a lot of shifts happening, but talking to a funder whenever there's an opportunity, I recommend that with every single group. The caveat to that is kind of what Brad mentioned at the very onset, is knowing when deadlines are. Don't call a funder a week before the deadline and try to work through your project. You need some time, they need some time. So knowing when these deadlines are so you can have these conversations is really important. So planning becomes another strategy in this grant writing world.
So going on Brad's comment about the scheduling, what is on average the lead up time? I don't know, maybe I'm making this up. I don't know. Did somebody say 8 weeks? Like, I'm just thinking, if, like Brad, you said you guys have 3 intakes, so maybe for an organization having, within the office, a calendar of when the deadline is it approximately 8 weeks to begin to look at that, or sort of what lead up? Because again, I think organizations could have it on a common schedule. Oh, this, here we're at the 8 week prior to this, or whatever that timeline is. But it's putting it in a calendar. And so what would you recommend for lead up?
Yeah, I can only speak to Jumpstart's process, which maybe Sara knows a bit more about the more other grantors, but we put those timelines on our website. So if you go to our community development grant website, those 3 intakes are mapped out for you. When's the intake open? When's the deadline to submit? When are we going to get the decision to you? And then, any other aspects of the grant process as well. So yeah, Sandra's pulling it up right now. And so from that perspective, we try not to shy away from it. It's the funding details and timelines aspect there, Sandra. Yeah. Within reason, like a couple dates we might miss depending on the time frame, but we try to stick to that schedule because we know that people have their own routines. And so generally speaking, from Jumpstart's perspective, if you roll those years forward, that's the next year's intake windows, basically. So yeah, you can see there, it is a long process. It takes time. And back to Sara's note about, don't reaching out too close to the deadline. There's so many grants that come in the last minute that you just really have to take what comes across your desk at that point. But if you have the schedule in place and you have the ability to reach out and ask questions prior to these deadlines, I'm more than willing to work with you on that for sure.
I think it goes back to planning as well, Catriona, that you kind of mentioned, should groups have a calendar so they kind of have a good idea? In an ideal world, yes, have a grant calendar, have little notifications on your that pop up to say, okay, this is coming up, chat with the team. But when groups are volunteer run, when they're doing it as a separate, they love the sport, so they want to work in this area, that becomes a little bit more challenging. So it's if there's any way to have someone that is focused on grants, that's part of their volunteer role or even as their paid role, that's a really strong aspect to just keep a pulse on what's happening. And the site that Sandra shared of grants that relate to sport, that's a good thing to check in once a month. I do it once a week because that's very much related to my work and my business, but even once a month for sport groups, just to do a quick check, what's coming up, what's happening, and also continuing the conversations around what do we need funding for, because that will also better position you. So you're not always responding to a funding application or a grant, but you're looking for funds that are going to support the work you already want to do. So that's a really big piece. I also wanted to mention, I think when Sandra pulled up the Jumpstart, there's deadlines around when applications open and when they close. So some funders, you can't see their application until the application opens. And so the amount of time you need to complete an application, you might not know until you can see it. Some are simple, some are more robust. And so that planning piece, the 6 to 8 week mark, is strong, just so you can get an idea of what level of information you're going to need before applying and how much time. Again, going back to volunteers, if you're doing this after work, you have a life, all these other competing responsibilities, more time, of course, is always better. So
I think that's a key. I mean, I think, a lot of our members are run by volunteers. They're working jobs trying to pay their own bills, and then they're volunteering to either help their kids' sports, help other sports, or subsidize even sports. So I get it. I'm just writing some notes from what you guys are saying. A couple of things I want to talk about afterwards: reporting, partnering with other groups. But excuse me, is there one of the questions that came up on the last time we had this, and I think it's a real big thing on people's mind, is what are some of the key things to avoid when grant writing? Because there have been questions about how you write, etc. But are there, from either of you, would you say there are don'ts to do within the grant writing application?
Brad, I'm gonna let you go first, and then I'll do a catch-all after.
Okay, sounds good. It might sound simple, but I mean, just honestly reviewing your grant and like spelling errors, like just small issues that you would have, going through a university exam, or for example, something like that. Like just giving yourself the proper time to really review through and ensure that you're answering the question. I think I've seen other grants relative to Jumpstarts. I think ours is fairly straightforward and simple, and it's shorter than most, I think. But I've read thousands of them, to be honest, at this point now, and some try to cram their answer into the first question they see on the form, right? And they lay it out right away, and then you're not even really tying it back to what the question was asked or what the information requested was. And then that turns into a repetitive grant the rest of the way down, because they might even say, see the answer above, or, something along those lines. And quite honestly, that's challenging as a reviewer to try and make a proper decision based on what's being presented, because you're trying to pull out what they're trying to get and read between the lines versus tying it back directly. So it goes back to that schedule, honestly, giving yourself the proper time. And you mentioned it, like we all have other things going on in our lives, but taking the time, working at it a little bit here and there, and giving yourself that review period so that you can sit there and read the question again, and then read your answer and go, did I actually tie this back to that? And I think I also kind of try to equate it to a job interview. Like, you are trying to be specific. Like, this is you putting your best foot forward. if you keep it very high level and general, it's really hard to make a decision based on that. We have a question in our grant that talks about how the organization is addressing some of the systemic barriers in place. And I've read some where I could probably just take that paragraph and put it into Google and see that definition written somewhere, right? It's take the time to make that personal, specific to your organization. How are you making a difference, and how are you working with your community? And provide examples. We want to know what you're up to. We want to see what works, and be honest. If it didn't work, you tried something that didn't work, put that in there too.
There's so many don'ts.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Sarah.
Actually, no, Catriona, you respond to Brad if you have any sort of thoughts there, and then I'll do some catch-all ideas.
Well, I love the fact of, I think people are panicking. It's like, I need this. And like you said, it's, I filled out forms where I'm like, oh yeah, oh, I said it all. Oh, I said too much. The rereading, you know, even if you're sort of one person doing it, get a colleague, get another parent, get someone else, get a board member, whoever it might be, to read over the application and allow probably clear eyes, you know, new eyes to look at it, reread it, to give advice. And I loved your comment, Brad, about provide an example, whether it didn't go well or it did go well. I don't think, you know, I think we need to remember that grant applications are not you've succeeded, right? It's okay, I failed at this, but here's what I learned, and now I'm going to do this. I think I'm guessing, you know, you want people to be transparent, and you want them to be honest, and you want them to learn. And so if there was an example that did fail, give that example. So I really love that, because that's a hard thing, I think, for organizations to admit. And so just hopefully people hearing that is accepted and that's okay, because now they want to improve. Hopefully that is a real sort of lesson for everybody, that, okay, they're not going to reject me just because I messed that one up. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that transparency is really important, and it's becoming more important with funders as well. They look for the growth of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. So love that. So I have a few, there's a number of don'ts, but I'll kind of go through a couple high level ones. But make it easy for a funder to say yes. So Brad was talking about, you know, you're trying to put it all in here, and then you're repeating this, and then it's not specific to your organization. Funders want to give you money, but you have to make it easy for them to understand what you're trying to do. So it doesn't always have to be like share everything, every detail. Be very clear, very concise, and answer the question. I think that's the biggest thing. Even myself, when I'm writing applications, I find that I get into, I'm trying to finesse it or make it sound pretty or this. And then I have to go back and be like, is that actually the question that they asked? And am I actually responding to that question? Especially with funders that have multiple questions in one response, you'll answer the first one, but not the second one. So that's sort of the double check to make sure you're answering all the questions when you have somebody else review it. That's something I always ask them to do. Make sure I'm answering everything and capturing it all. Because sometimes when you've been writing for a while, you think you've said it all, but it might not be coming clear to someone that's reading it for the first time. Another really easy one is do not use jargon. Every sector, especially sport, we have all of our abbreviations. We have all these words that we know, but don't assume that a funder or a reviewer knows your sector or knows your sport at the same level. That comes back to being clear and concise. So no jargon as best as you possibly can, or define it in advance. But when you have character counts and things, that's where some of the strategies come in, but don't use jargon. And then another last one that I'll just mention is around your budget. We could probably talk about budgets for a whole session as well, but oftentimes the application and the information, the activities, the ideas, the outcomes, they don't align with your budget line. So make sure what you're asking for funding for is directly related and correlates to what you need to achieve what you've outlined in the application. If that's staff, if that's evaluation, if that's equipment, whatever it is, make sure those line items line up with the rest of what you're saying in your application. Because funders look at that, they're like, this actually doesn't match. And that's a red flag because you're not aligning what you're asking for with what you say you're going to do. So I'll stop there. Those are a few tips.
I did big don'ts and probably easy to fix don'ts, right?
Yeah.
Because what you're saying is review, again, another set of eyes, rereading it yourself, and the budget side. So I'm going to pivot a little bit because what you brought up there with budget, when we look at the different grants, and if organizations, like you said, if it's for staff, if it's for equipment, whatever it might be, are there certain no areas when you're looking for grants? Because there'd be some that would be for equipment. There'd be some that are for operation. There are some that, you know, projects, some that capital. So how exactly, and I guess what I'm saying is if an organization has to sort of reshuffle their budget so that the money is needed for a certain area, how do they know specifically? Will it be quite obvious within the grant application that this is only allowed for certain areas, or how do they do that? Is there one area that's recommended over another?
The guidelines of every grant should be very clear, stating what is eligible or not. Most grantors, I find they give you a list of eligible expenses and then ineligible expenses. So it gives you that opportunity to almost see the contrast, because you're like, oh, I think this fits here. And then you read the ineligible, you're like, no, that's actually where that would have fit. If you don't know for certain, then when you have a conversation with the funder, that's a good opportunity to say, hey, I'm not sure if this qualifies. I've done that many times where I'm like, this is gray. If I position it this way, I think it works. And then I talk to the funder and they say, no, that's a hard line. And we view it this way. And so those conversations become really important. But I'll let Brad speak to what his experience is too.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. Yeah, most try to write what's eligible and what's not. From our perspective, the way I try to present it to people from how Jumpstart operates is we're trying to service kids in financial need, kids that are playing in a sport. So start there. What does it cost to get that kid on the field, the court, the ice rink, whatever it is, and work your way out from there. And that, as you kind of pull back from the child participating in the sport, it gets less and less of what Jumpstart can fund, right? So like I can fund the skates that are going on his or her shoes, like that type of stuff, less so the executive director salary, right? That's less impactful. I know that it's an important position. I'm not trying to downplay that role, but when it comes to funding, we want to ensure that the kid is participating in the sport. And so it really is a conversation. And I think it goes back to what we've already mentioned, reaching out, asking the question beforehand, but then also following up afterwards. If you get a partial fund, like we do partial funding in our perspective, find out why, find out what I'm partially funding, or find out what's partially been approved, and then you can kind of understand going forward and figure out what makes sense based on what you need.
From a funder perspective, is it looked upon favorably? Do you sort of get put into the higher bracket of, we're going to look at this one first, if organizations partner together? Obviously, if you're not just trying to make up a partnership, but if you have a project or you know, an opportunity to work with a couple of organizations together, is that to their advantage, rather than if there was a situation where they could both apply or they could apply together? Can you sort of talk on that partnering situation?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. So it's a question on our grant. So yes, it's important. Like, what partnerships do you have? And it doesn't have to be financial. It can be in kind. It could be just, you know, how are you recruiting the kids, right? Are you working with an organization where they're the ones kind of referring kids over to your program? So yes, that's very beneficial. I would also say that adding in partnerships and showing support shows sustainability and success of what you're trying to achieve. We, especially this year, the demand was much higher than what we had in terms of the funding we could give out. I think the last intake, the total ask of funding was 5 times the amount that I actually had to give out. So it was just like astronomical, right? So from that perspective, for me to be able to go into their budget and say, yeah, okay, we can fund this portion of it, and it looks like they've got 3 or 4 other partners that could make this successful, it's more reasonable or realistic, I should say, not reasonable, that it'll happen, right? That it'll take place. And then Jumpstart funding and granting funding, for the most part, we don't do multi-year funding, so we can't guarantee it's there next year, right? So that's another thing to factor in too. If you have partnerships and other resources and support, then hopefully it's not going to disappear. I love funding organizations that are just starting up and finding a new project, but I also want to hope that that's not just providing a one-off for the kids of that community and it's not there next year for them.
I think a big piece too with, oh wow, my brain just went blank. Partnerships. I think it really strengthens an application when groups are demonstrating that they're partnering, because there's a ton of duplication across all sectors, all community work. And so when you're partnering, like you were mentioning, Catriona, it's like if we have one organization apply and another organization apply, if you're doing the same work, you're likely you're now becoming competitors when you're both trying to achieve the same goal. So partnering will strengthen your position as an applicant to say, okay, we're actually coming together to do X, Y, Z. You might be more successful in receiving more funding together than separate entities. So that'd be one piece that strengthens, and just avoiding that duplication piece. But I know in talking to some funders as well, if you are working in a very specific niche or even a specific sport, like I'll bring up cricket, for instance. I know that there's not a ton of cricket organizations in Calgary, or fields or things like that. So if you are the only or one of a few organizations doing that work, identifying that potentially in that collaboration or partnership question can help explain why you're not partnering, or why you are the organization that needs to deliver X, Y, Z and not other ones because of your position, because of your knowledge. So there is a way to position yourself that you don't have to partner, but demonstrating why you're not, especially if that is an application on a grantor's application process.
Is it frowned upon? I guess that's what I would say. If you have a project, and whether you're partnering or not, and you're applying to a grant and there's a similar grant, can you do the exact same application? I mean, do grantors talk to each other, and is it like, oh, they talk to me, well, they talk to me? And is that sort of a frowned upon? Because I think for sport organizations and groups looking for funding, they want, if they could send out 100 of them, the same thing, great, because they're going to take the risk on what they can get. But is that a wait and see? Because, I don't know. It's a question that I think has come up a couple of times.
Sarah, you want me to take it, or you want to go?
I'll go. I have a couple of thoughts. So first, I have heard and been told that grantors do talk to each other. So if you're applying for the same thing, they do have conversations. It is a network. It's not saying every intake they're having conversations, but sometimes the reviewers overlap. Sometimes they do say if there's multi-year funding there, that can happen. I actually recommend groups that they can reuse information, but no grant is the same. No grant is copy paste, copy paste. You always are going to have to edit. You're going to have to make sure you're answering that question. So again, reading the specific question, because each grantor has some nuances around what their goals are and what they're trying to achieve. And I think we forget that sometimes, that the reason a grantor is giving out funding is because they have a mandate and a mission as well. They're trying to create change. They're trying to implement a certain area. And so you are now the conduit to help them achieve their mission. They give you funding to do that. So every grantor is going to have specifics around what they're trying to do. And your job is to make sure you respond to that. So copy paste directly, not going to work, but there's definitely going to be some stuff you can reuse.
Yeah, I support that. That's what I was going to say. Basically the same. There is specifics within the grant, obviously, that you would need to alter and change. But yeah, even I know maybe not specific to Calgary in the context, but there are organizations that are probably on this call that are national, just like Jumpstart, and nationally we speak to each other too, right? If we see multiple grants across the country, we're talking as regional managers to ensure that we're supporting it to the best abilities as well, and not duplicating efforts. So from that perspective, for sure. it goes back to transparency too. If there's an opportunity to be transparent in the grant and say you're applying for this and that elsewhere, that's helpful too. Again, back to trust-based philanthropy, it's a conversation, and I've reached out to organizations where they've said, you know, I've got a pending grant from United Way or whatever, for example. I reach out and say, okay, what happens if you don't get that, right? Like if I fully fund you and you don't get that grant, is this going away, or how do we make this work? So having that information up front is more beneficial than not.
What about when an organization then receives a grant? Whether it's fully funding, partially funding, whatever. Can you talk a little bit about the reporting side and timeline of, you know, specifics of using that grant money? Because there are very, you know, I know there are specifics around when it has to be used by, but also the reporting side. Can you talk a little bit about how important that is, and you know, sort of, because I think sometimes people think just the grant writing, you do the application, oh, you get money, everything's good now. It's like the work isn't done.
Right. Yeah. No, I can, again, just specifically to Jumpstart's perspective, the reporting has changed over my 5 years of what we've been asking for and what we require, and it's changed in my mind to less strict on what we're asking for, because we don't want to put organizations, to your point, there's volunteer run, there's large organizations, small organizations. But generally speaking, our perspective is, what was the impact? What, you know, we provided this funding, and how did it make a difference in the community that you were trying to reach? And so we do ask some demographic questions in terms of participant numbers and where they come from. And but obviously we have an opportunity to opt out if you're not comfortable, or it's, you know, through the school, for example, and the schools don't collect that information. But really, truthfully, we're trying to share the stories of success and wins within the community. So that's what we ask for, is how did this make a difference? Tell us about that difference. If you can, share some pictures, because from our perspective, we've got a giant machine behind us called Canadian Tire, where we can push out some wonderful, wonderful messages that are taking place across the community, and that's where we go to for it. So it not only, you know, is helpful for making that difference in the community, but it will shine a light on your organization as well, and hopefully, you know, in some cases nationally. So yeah, we try to make it less strict, but it is tied to the financial component. You get 70% of our funding up front upon approval, and then 30% upon the reporting requirement. So that is impactful, obviously. I think some organizations forget that, and they're sitting there waiting for the last little bit, and it's, well, you still need to fill out the report. And then from our fiscal year, we're the regular calendar year for our fiscal year. So the expectation is the funding goes out with it, or is utilized within the calendar year. But again, there's specific scenarios where that might not work. And that's where that trust-based philanthropy comes back. And that's a relationship that I try to build with the organizations that we work with.
Yeah, I usually tell groups that reporting starts at the application stage, because there's usually a question around outcomes, measurement, evaluation. The funder's looking to say, okay, how are you going to know you achieved what you wanted to apply for? How do you know if you achieved the outcomes you said? And so generally, you as the applicant are positioned to say, I'm going to measure X, Y, Z criteria. So you put that in your application. Then the funder can later say, okay, did you achieve X, Y, and Z at your reporting piece? So thinking about it at the application process can position you, or better position you, for when you have to report back, because you've already identified the metrics that you want to track or measure over the course of your grant. And some funders will also give you some level of guidance of what they want or what their expectations are for reporting. Of course, a deadline, but then there might be qualitative. You know, Brad was talking about stories, testimonials, pictures. That's more qualitative because they want to be able to tell the story. Some funders really want the data. Sometimes they really want strong, hard measurement. So knowing that and what the funder is requiring of you is really important. So then you can track it throughout the project. You don't want to get to the end and realize you spent, or you ran 10 programs over the course of the year and you have no idea how many people came. You have no idea how many registered. You don't know what the success is. And you're like, oh no, now I have to go back, go through all our spreadsheets, go online to all our registrations, do it as you go. And then your reporting will be super easy at the end. But if you forget, and then you just get caught up in doing all the work, and then you don't remember you have to report back, then it's really onerous. And that's when I think applicants get frustrated with reporting. It's like, oh, this is so much work, but it's because they left it from a week before it's due. So.
Yeah, good points, both of you. I think, the fact is you are starting your reporting when you do the application, knowing what the impact is. And sometimes it is hard. I mean, I know some of our events, we can't get the full numbers, but the impact, whether you get some quotes even from participants, whether it's a project like that, and the telling the stories. And, I would just encourage those who are on this call, let us at Sport Calgary help tell your story so that we can, share what you've done, the impact you've had, and also share the story of how a grant has helped you. Because again, we want to help those who are coming after you to be able to be successful. Both Brad and Sara have talked about there's money out there and they don't want to hold the money back. They want to give the money out, and we want to make sure that the organizations get the money in their hands because you're making great impacts in the community. With just a few minutes left, I want to open it up to the participants. Do you have specific questions? You can write them in the chat for Brad or Sara.
While we wait on that, Catriona,
Yeah.
I'll just make one note around reporting that we kind of alluded to early on around lessons learned. So if you did say you were going to report on XYZ and you didn't achieve what you thought, that is also appropriate to tell a funder and be like, we wanted to do this, XYZ happened, and this is actually what happened, but this is what we learned. There's also space for that to be happening more and more with reporting. So again, don't feel like you have to make up numbers or make up results to say, oh yeah, we achieved it. Like we spent your money and did what we said. It's like, oh, actually, no, we learned there was different barriers that we weren't aware of. And that's really important because funders also work with a number of groups. So they're also sharing those lessons to other groups. And when Brad has those conversations and the front end of an application, he can say, actually, a group did that. And have you thought about this? So those lessons get transferred on to other organizations.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go through a couple of questions. We've been running our mandate with a nonprofit mentality, but without registration. We wonder if the incorporation is a prerequisite to all funding eligibility.
It's a tough one. So Jumpstart requires, first and foremost, you're required to be a qualified donee as per Canada Revenue Agency. So the addition to that we've kind of came out of the pandemic with is we got approval through our legal system to award funding to non-for-profit organizations that are registered here in Alberta, for me specifically, but all provinces. But it has to be tied back to our mandate of children in financial need and sport and recreation. So it can't just be an organization that's not directly, that's not their primary purpose for running it. So it goes back to the reach out to the organization and understand what their criteria are. Everyone is different in that perspective.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. And then this one, I have an unusual question. Do you look at qualifications during a grant application? There is only one standardized and recognized cycling education program in Canada. It's called CanBike. There are 3 instructors in Alberta with CanBike certification, yet many organizations offer cycling education. My point is that I'm not going to teach swimming or CPR because I'm not qualified to do so. Is it relevant or important that we state our qualifications during a grant request to offer cycling education, or does this disqualify us as elitist?
Wow.
Tough questions today.
I would say that is beneficial to know that, from our perspective, especially when it's a sport activity involving youth, is to understand the qualifications and where this expertise is coming from. And so from my perspective, that's a positive. It does not come across as elitist. It comes across as you've done your work and effort to get yourself in a position to be successful and educate these youth to the best of your ability and teach them. That's how we try to, our approved activities have that laddered system up where there's training for coaches involved in it, right? So there's a national sport body or there's a provincial sport body that's managing and controlling who is teaching these youth. And you're not, like, I'm not awarding funding to a neighborhood karate studio that's run out of a basement of a person that we have no idea who or what they are doing. So yeah, 100% training, anything that leads to bettering leaders and being a part of who's instructing is more beneficial than not.
Sara, you anything to add on that? I think, you know, as Brad said, I think it's that transparency side. Help the funder to understand the background, because the funders don't know everything about every sport. Well, maybe you do, but I'll just say you don't.
Yeah, I think just back to my point of, if you're the only organization doing X work, or with the only organization with those qualifications, that positions you to be unique to serve or provide programming that others can't. So again, I agree with Brad, not elitist. You're positioning yourself as the best to offer that type of programming.
Perfect. Any other questions as a group? Sandra, I don't see any, but I'm just making sure. I don't think so. Any last comments, Brad or Sara? I mean, you know, you guys, you sort of, you put it into layman's term. I don't even know if I can use that, but you know, to me, I've looked at grant applications and I get super overwhelmed. Any just sort of last sort of advice just on this workshop, again, the online side, before we go into the in-person in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I just adding on the fact, like, give yourself the opportunity to be successful in the grant. Like, provide yourself some time, don't rush through it. Read the whole grant before you even start typing. Like, do an overview, right? Like, what is going to be asked of me and where is it going to be asked? And so that avoids that issue of answering and spilling everything on the first question, right? Yeah, I've seen so many grants where, and Sara, you brought it up, like, be intentional. Don't just throw things in there to fill a word count or you know, try to make it sound like you're doing much more than you actually are. Like, really spend the time to answer the question, be specific and intentional with what you're trying to apply for, tie the budget back. To your point, Sara, about the budget, like, you read a line item, they're asking for a certain amount of funding, and you go back into the grant and you're like, it wasn't even discussed, right? It wasn't even brought up anywhere. So now you're just throwing in an extra 10K for the heck of it, right? So those types of things, spend time, really review it, don't rush. That's a reason we give that long window for our intake period, so that people aren't feeling rushed. And that's why we give those 3 different intakes throughout the year, right? So you don't feel like you have to apply for something at the start of the year for something that's taking place at the back half of the year. So yeah, give yourself an opportunity to be successful.
And I think I'd just say to groups, anyone that's new to grant writing, yeah, give yourself the time, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. 100%. I still can remember the first time I've written grants, and I was also like deer in headlights, not quite sure where to start, how to do it, but working with a team, working with some supports, whether it's Sport Calgary, whether it's reaching out to other grant writers or talking to funders, there's other resources to support you, and it gets easier. The first one is always the hardest. It gets easier over time. So just a little bit of encouragement that groups that are new to this process, it doesn't have to be as difficult. Just give yourself the time and be kind and patient with yourself as you learn a new skill. Grant writing is a skill, and just give yourself that grace to learn it as a skill, just like you're building your muscles in a sport and building your skill set at sport. It's the same idea. It's just not as fun maybe as being in the gym. So.
Well, lactic acid isn't quite as high in the grant writing, but frustration's probably higher. So yeah, very good advice. Just to remind everybody that every 2 weeks in our bulletin, we do send out reviewing the list of grants. And a reminder that on June 8th, free for members from 9 till 11, here at Sport Calgary WHL Boardroom, we will be having an in-person grant writing workshop with Sara. There was a question, Sara, is it sort of the same information that's going to be covered, or can you just give a quick overview of what you do at the in-person?
It'll be a little bit more in-depth, a little bit more skills focused. This was pretty high level around trends, around we'll be able to go through more specifics around how to position your grants, definitely opportunities to ask questions. So there'll be much more interactive to say, hey, I have this example and we can talk through it. We'll also be going through some of the high level or specific questions that a funder will ask and how to respond to those. So it's going to go into a more granular level, still high level because each grantor is different, but more specific. So there'll be lots of information that people will take away that more from a skill side rather than a knowledge side, I would say.
Yeah, perfect. Which I think is what, we can talk overview, but until you get right into the guts of it, that's when I think a lot of people need the help. So thank you, Brad and Sara, so much for helping us with this. Sandra has put in the link to register for the workshop. So that is again on June 8th from 9 till 11. Thank you everybody for joining us. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to us. A reminder to sport groups, if you are a part of All Sport One Day, it is June 17th and August 19th. If you are not, let us know if you would like to be. And just a reminder, our declaration of inclusion is posted on our website and at our events. And if you want to have a copy of that, please let us know. Calgary Surge, if anybody followed on the weekend, they had their season opener. They have embraced our declaration of inclusion and put their logo on the top of it and are displaying it everywhere as well. So we're really, really proud of that. So thank you everybody for joining us. Reach out to us if you have any questions at all, and hopefully see a lot of you on June 8th. So Brad, Sara, thank you so much. And I look forward to chatting with everybody soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.